Hi, and welcome to Mindful, Beautiful, and Thriving, a podcast series by Tharaka Foundation focused on youth mental health. Before we begin today's episode, I just wanted to let you all know that all content that is found in our podcast is created for informational purposes only. This content is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, treatment, or therapy. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition, and never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard in this podcast. Thank you so much, and without further ado, let's get started.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Mindful, Beautiful, and Thriving. Today, with us, we have an extraordinary guest, Dr. J. McClelland. He's a professor in the psychology department and director of Center for Mind-Brain Computation and Technology at Stanford. The research includes a variety of topics from cognitive science and neuroscience to learning, memory, reading, mathematical cognition, and so much more. With Dr. J, we're going to dive into the nature of learning and how and when we should care about it. But before we begin, Dr. J, please share more about yourself.
Thank you very much for having me on your podcast. So, yes, let me tell you a tiny bit about my experience growing up. My dad was a member of the United States Foreign Service, Diplomatic Corps. He was assigned to different embassies all over the world. And my earliest memories are from a time when I lived in England. Then we lived in the States for a while. We moved to the Arab world. I lived in Saudi Arabia, Beirut, Lebanon, went to high school in Switzerland for 2 years, and came back to the States finally for my university education. And I tell you this in part because this diversity of experience in different parts of the world gave me, I think, a bit different of a perspective than many people have, at least many Americans have, which tends to be a bit more narrowly grounded around their particular hometown. I know today many people have immigrated to the States from many different parts of the world, some of the parts of the world I've been to, and others that I haven't been to. And so we're all coming together with a very diverse range of cultural backgrounds and things that we take as like for granted, or basic things that we understand, and other things that are new to us and other people seem to find to be second nature, but we don't. And I had that experience so often myself growing up that it has colored my perspective about the nature of who I am and what makes each of us who we are.
Wow. So is that what inspired you to research in the field of neuroscience, psychology, and mathematics, growing up in a diverse background in the Arabs, UK and England and US?
I don't know. I think there were probably many factors, but there were certain things from that experience that did make me curious about learning. So one thing was I had a learning disability when I was a child. I was very slow to learn how to read. And when I was in the third grade, I went through a very extensive battery of assessments to determine whether I had some disability or not. And it was determined that I was dyslexic at that time. And later on, I went to this school in Switzerland where I was taking courses where supposedly I was learning foreign languages. And I always did really well in these classes. I got A's. They even skipped me up a level in my French class at one point. But I never had the sense that I could like speak French at all. I was like memorizing stuff in a textbook. And if I had to speak to somebody in French, I was like clueless and paralyzed. So what is it if I learn this stuff by memorizing something out of the textbook? That's not really learning, right? It's not learning to speak a language. So these kinds of things have, like, what makes it so that some people learn better than others? What makes it so that certain kinds of learning don't really help with what it is that you're supposedly learning? I think those things contributed to all the interest that I've had as a scientist.
Yeah, and this connects right to my next question, where I was going to ask you about the nature of learning, because you mentioned like the difference between memorizing and learning, and I feel like a lot of kids my age, that's what we do, especially in like different subjects like math, for example. We're just memorizing the formulas, using it for a month, passing the test, and then forgetting everything. So, what is like, how do you actually learn? Is it like learning and then remembering, then recalling? And how do we learn for and keep something in our mind for a long time?
Yeah. So this is the kind of question that I spent a lot of time researching over the years. And I think one thing that's very useful to know, and that many people in my field ignored for a very long time, is the fact that our brains have what my colleagues and I call complementary learning systems. Learn different systems that learn in very different ways. And one of these is like what you might call the memorization system. But more generally, it's the part of our brains that allows us to remember specific things that have happened to us, especially very recently. And like just once, like where did I park my car? Or maybe in your case, my bicycle this morning. Or what did you have for dinner last night, right? You could probably remember that. If you didn't have this part of your brain, it's called the hippocampus. It's actually, there's one on each side of your brain and they work together in this funny way. So if you lose just one, it doesn't matter that much. But this one man who was profoundly epileptic lost the hippocampus on both sides of his brain because the surgeon thought that was a good thing to do to help cure his epilepsy. And it turned out that he could not remember at all what he'd had for breakfast, for dinner the night before, or even who he'd been talking to 5 minutes ago. If they stepped out of the room and then came back in, he would like, oh, hi, who are you? They might have had a conversation for a half hour where this person introduced themselves and they got to know each other a little bit. And while he's thinking about it actively in his mind, it seems like he's there and following. But when you just completely forgets everything, if you give a gap of even a half a minute or so from interrupting his mental, his current mental sort of state. Yet he knew how to speak English. He knew how to carry on a conversation. He could find out about who you were and have a conversation with you about it. He just wouldn't retain this information. He passed all kinds of basic cognitive tests. He had been epileptic all his life, so he wasn't the greatest student because he was having seizures all the time. But to the extent that he had cognitive abilities, they weren't affected by his brain damage. So to recap what I was telling you about this patient, after he had this surgery that removed this brain structure called the hippocampus from both sides of his brain, he seemed perfectly normal in many ways. His general intelligence was intact. He knew general facts and he could make inferences in the ordinary way we would expect of ordinary people, but he was unable to learn new things. At least he couldn't learn them rapidly at all. And yet, before this brain damage, he had learned a lot that he still retained. So, the way we understand this finding is to think that the hippocampus, the part of the brain that was lesioned in this patient, is a system that allows us to learn new things rapidly. But somehow, for things that we have experienced many times and that are part of our intuitive understanding of things or our knowledge about what words to say when we're trying to communicate certain ideas to each other, the knowledge that underlies that is somehow stored in a very different way in other parts of your brain. And in fact, one of the interesting things is that patients like this patient were able to learn new words that that didn't exist in the English language before their brain damage occurs, but they learned them gradually without ever being aware that they had learned them. They could just like Oh, yeah, I know what that word means, but just the same way you could say, yes, I know that a cat is a four-legged animal that purrs or something like that, but without knowing where he learned it. So we have this concept of semantic knowledge or the procedural knowledge, the knowledge we have about things like how to walk, how to ride a bike, how to play tennis, all these things. He was able to acquire new skills of that kind gradually in the same way that people do, but he couldn't even remember practicing that. So there are different kinds of learning systems in the brain. And when we're, asked to memorize, we're more or less relying on this, we might call it a fast learning system in that's sort of fast and superficial. One scientist who studied it fairly early called it simple memory because it's not thoughtful. It's just like memorizing, right?
So I understood that one important part of learning is retaining the information, and the retaining is in the hippocampus part of our brain. And one other thing you mentioned was that the people who didn't have a hippocampus, they learned gradually, just really slowly. And this reminded me of like how babies walk. No one teaches them specifically how to walk, they just notice it and gradually start walking. So that's
Yeah.
what I remind.
And nobody teaches you how to speak your language. Parents do correct their children from time to time, but really, basically, it's a matter of the child is hearing other people speak and they gradually start producing words themselves. And they start with one word at a time that maybe they could say milk or look birdie or something like that. And then gradually they become more and more proficient at their language. And that includes being able to control their vocal apparatus so that they articulate clearly. It also includes learning how to hear the rapid paced speech that adults typically use. So when mothers speak to their babies and they want their babies to understand, they speak slowly because the brain is not ready for the rapid paced speech that we usually use. And gradually, as children get older, these things become more and more refined, faster and faster, sharper and sharper, better and better, just from immersion in practicing and engaging with other people, learning your language, and so on. So our brains have this natural capacity to learn from immersion and experience. And then we go to school and they start teaching us things that we have to memorize. And those are just really different forms of learning.
Okay. So there's also another type, which, yeah, what we normally do is immersion and experience. So as I was listening to your mathematical cognition talk, you posed a question of why some people learn fast while it takes others lots of time. So could we dive deeper into this?
It is a very interesting and multifaceted, lots of different aspects of this issue. I like to emphasize how important it is, how much the speed of learning that we can achieve depends on what we already know. And one of the most important papers that I'm familiar with is a paper that's written by a neuroscientist. He happens to be a neuroscientist in Edinburgh, England. And he starts the paper by contrasting the experience of a young graduate student who is attending a seminar on a subject that they haven't got a lot of experience with compared to somebody who he's thinking about himself attending the same seminar. And his observation is that the PhD student, the young PhD student, would come away from this seminar without really being able to retain any of it, but that he, as this person with lots of experience in the topic area, will retain it far better. And we tend to call this, people use the word schema consistent learning, the idea that as we gain experience, we form implicit knowledge structures that people like to call schemas that make it easier for us to learn new things quickly And if we don't have the right schema for something, it doesn't stick. It doesn't hang together for us. It doesn't make sense. And so we won't be able to learn it at all. And when I was thinking about mathematical cognition a few years ago, and I was able to sit in on a class where some high school juniors and seniors were being exposed to trigonometry for the first time, there was a huge range of how different people picked up the material in the class. Some of them seemed to get it right away, and some of them seemed to be trying hard but not being able to get it. And of course, there was a subset that had basically tuned out completely and weren't trying to get it at all. But that might have been because they'd tried before in other math classes and they didn't have a schema for it. And so they had to get moved along to the next year of math. So they got put in the class and they didn't have a schema for the next class either. You know what I mean? My philosophy with respect to learning math is that you really shouldn't be asking people to learn stuff unless you already have established that they have the things that you expect them to have already learned before you teach them the next subject. But unfortunately, our education systems don't necessarily work that way. People get moved on because they can't flunk half the class, or for whatever reason, you've got to move people through the system. And I'm not saying we should be flunking half the class. I'm saying we should find ways of making sure that people only start to immerse themselves in subjects when they have the background that makes them ready for doing that. So I think that's one very important factor.
Yes?
I was going to say there's another very important
Oh,
factor
yes.
too.
Yes, I want to know.
Another very important factor is essentially how extensively and with what kind of attitude it is that people engage with the subject matter. And I can illustrate this from my own experience, perhaps. I was a pretty good math student when I was in high school. But when I went to college, I wasn't interested in math specifically at that point. I was actually interested in psychology, how people learn and why they do the things that they do. But I found myself taking a math class and I never really immersed myself in thinking about it, and I didn't do very well. Later on, I found that there was certain kind of math that I needed to understand to make progress on answering some of the questions that I wanted to understand as a scientist. And then it was like I wanted to learn it, and it was fun to learn it, and it was also easy to learn it. And I think that we struggle to create situations where people are necessarily encouraged to have or helped to find a constructive motivation for learning.
Do you have another point or?
No, I was done with that point.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So I understood that there's two or three main important parts to how we learn, or like why it takes some people a long time to learn and others short. So one, it's like the speed of learning, which depends on what we already know. So if people already know a lot on subject, it's easy for them to pick up on it. And this was backed by the experiment you did with the juniors and seniors learning trig. And then the other main important part is like the attitude in which they start. If they don't really want to do it, then we can't really force them to learn, and then they'd probably be really slow. And another part is having like constructive motivation to start, which will make it fun for them and easy. If it's not fun, it's not easy.
Yeah,
So,
I think that's you could overstate if it's not fun, it's not easy part. there are different ways that people become motivated. And my experience is that people who have learned a lot of math, even if they didn't think it was all that interesting, but if they somehow managed to learn it, when it comes time for them to use it, they have it. So there's many factors that could lead to a pathway where you would have the right kind of motivation. But I certainly think that for me and for many people, we learn most naturally and most effectively and perhaps most creatively when the subject is interesting to us and we're doing it because we have a passion for it.
Okay, so you need passion and interest too. So my
It
next
really
question is
helps.
that, yeah, so I would think that fast learners, like we just mentioned, they enjoy and they want to improve. So they're open to receiving new information. They're like passionate, like we just mentioned. So this leads me to wonder, can I enjoy a subject, be interested in it, but take a long time to learn information? For example, I could really love reading books, but if it takes me a long time to actually comprehend and understand what's going on, then is that like possible?
Great question. I love that question. I have heard it. So I think the answer is yes. And let me say a couple things about this based on my own personal experience. First of all, when I was in that school in Switzerland that I mentioned to you, I was actually in classes with other people, one of whom was like my roommate, and I realized that he would read the history assignment in about 15 minutes and be done. 10 pages of a very thick 2-column textbook. He would read it and say, okay, I got that. And he'd be done. And I would be like, partly because I had been dyslexic as a child and I'd grown out of it, but I still wasn't a fast reader in the sense of being able to read a lot of words quickly. It took me like 4 or 5 times as long as him to read these 10 pages. But I think I actually understood it at some level better than he did. Maybe I was already a kind of a person who like was thinking about why this was true and relating the things to each other as I was reading, or maybe just the fact that I couldn't read it more quickly allowed the ideas to interact with each other better in my mind than they did in his. He did fine in the class, but the teacher didn't really find him to be a particularly interesting student. Whereas, yeah, so there's approaching things slowly, learning them at your own pace in a way that makes sense to you is really, I think, a powerful way of thinking about how we should proceed with learning. And I think it's especially relevant in mathematics as well, because I think mathematics. So, this is the second thing I was wanting to say based on my own experience.
Mhm.
There have been parts of mathematics that I realized I really wanted to understand. And there have been friends of mine and colleagues of mine who already understood these parts of mathematics and made me feel like an idiot when they would say, oh, surely you understand blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, no, that doesn't make any sense to me at all. What are you talking about? And I realized at those times that I couldn't just hear them say it once and expect to understand it. It would actually require me to go through the ideas a few times and relate them to each other in different ways and think about why they were true from different points of view. And then gradually they would start to make sense. And then, and then I would have the same intuitions that they would have eventually. And so throughout my experience as a scientist, I've repeatedly confronted this situation because in the work that I do, there are many people who are very mathematical, much more so than I am myself. And I have benefited from learning about what they understand. But it takes me a long time sometimes to get it and catch up with where they are. But it's worth it, I think, in cases where I have some specific reason and desire to learn. So I think that most of us can eventually learn what we want to learn, even if we learn it at different paces than other people. and that the wanting is probably ultimately the most important factor.
Okay, so wanting to learn is the most important part. And then one other thing I really liked that you mentioned was that you can't hear something once and expect to know it. You have to actually put the time and effort and connect it with your past knowledge to actually fully understand something. So I really liked
Yes,
that point.
great.
Mhm. So my next question, is it possible for me to be a fast learner in one subject and a slow in another subject? And is learning subject specific or mood specific?
My computer didn't crash, but it seemed to be tempted to do it. Went blank for a second there.
Oh, no.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
We're
I can
still
hear
here?
you now.
Great.
Yes.
Okay. So I, the answer to your question is yes, you could learn some things faster than others, and your mood probably does make a difference in how you're learning and how well you would learn. If you're distracted or anxious or particularly worried about how well you're going to learn, I think this is something that some of my colleagues have studied. People who have a sense that people think that people like them can't learn very well, they become worried about this. And they're not really thinking about actually the material they're trying to learn. They're thinking about whether it's true that they're not able to learn it, and they're not using their time towards learning the material. And so it's very important for us to find ways to encourage people to take the material itself to be what's of interest and find ways of engaging with it more effectively. And that is like mood or attitude or dependent. And those things can be changed. You could put people in a certain frame of mind. I guess it's like frame of mind is very important for learning. One woman who was in my department who was an Asian woman by birth, but had been a professor in the United States for many years, did an experiment where she gave Asian girls a math, and if she reminded them that they were Asian, they did really well in the math test. But if she reminded them that they were girls, they did really badly in the math test. And she was emphasizing how the way we think about ourselves, who we are, what we identify with, affects our mindset. Now, I think things are changing, and women are beginning to feel that women can actually learn math. It was a belief that many people used to have that wasn't possible, and it was a self-fulfilling kind of thing. Might not be as true anymore, at least for certain people whose cultural context raises them to think differently about who they are in that sense. But I think that these things are actually very important. And she did this experiment to alert all of us to the fact that how we frame ourselves, how we think about ourselves, how we think about ourselves right now while we're trying to learn is actually very important for how well we're going to learn.
Yes, so I liked the experiment you talked about the ones where they gave Asian girls a math test. And so the main key takeaway in that is that how we view ourselves affects it a lot. And you also mentioned to the point that our mood affects how well we learn, which goes back to what you said that the attitude in which we start will affect how much better if we learn like a lot or a little bit. And then,
Yeah.
yes, you can be a fast and a slow learner. And then next, I want to know, as middle schoolers and high schoolers, how can we identify when to care about learning?
So I think you're asking me an interesting question. And when I try to think about it for myself, the best I can do is to say, if you find something that engages you, then you should take that seriously. There's so many different things that you could do with your life. And not everybody is going to be a math whiz. Not everybody is going to be a tech executive. Some people are going to be amazing at engaging other people and thinking about how to prepare healthy meals. Somehow or other that connects with their interests. So one of my sisters-in-law, that's what she does. She has a podcast called The Speedy Vegan, or a whole website called The Speedy Vegan, where she is passionately helping other people figure out how to eat healthy and get dinner on the table quickly and have fun doing it. And it's like where you find some engagement for yourself is where you're going to learn. And there's so many ways to contribute that I feel like we should all be like, oh, what's me? Where do I get excited? What makes me feel like I have something to contribute here? So my being a psychologist is something that came out of my experience. Some of the experiences I described, maybe some other ones that I didn't talk about, but it always motivated me. And whenever anything relevant to that came along, I just found myself engaged, in the right mood, interested. And so I guess that's my answer to your question. If you find yourself motivated, then go with it. If you find yourself unmotivated, maybe you could work on that. Maybe there's a reason why something's going on in this particular learning setting, which is not the most optimal for you. I have to admit that in different courses that I took from different teachers, the motivation often depended on my sense that the teacher had an interest or cared about whether I learned or whether other people learned. And we all have to, of course, we all want to succeed in all of our subjects because we want to get into a good college and things like that. But to the extent that you have some control over those things, I would definitely encourage everyone to take those issues seriously and ask themselves how they can control their own learning environment to optimize their experience.
Awesome. So you mentioned that you should continue and care about learning where you find something that engages you, and you should go into that. And you also said another important thing, that to check the learning setting, the motivation could depend on your teacher. And I remember this, like when we had a really good math teacher, everyone actually was interested in learning. But when our math teacher was herself not even that interested in it, then no one really enjoyed even coming to class.
Yeah, exactly. We've all been there, I think.
Yeah. So many of your research papers, so switching gears a little, many of your research papers are about reading speed. So how can we increase our reading speed? And then in general, what habits can we start to learn faster?
I think as we've talked about several times already, for me, learning faster is probably a bad way to think about what it is that you're trying to do. I know that we get assigned way too much material, especially in English class, to read, at least for somebody like me. And so there is a pressure to get better at that. But what I found in the work that I did about reading was that there were two pretty distinct dimensions of it. One was something that we could identify with a sort of a rate of processing the actual visual information on the page. But the other was much more about whether you were like understanding what you were reading as you read it. And we actually measured this. We had a listening comprehension task as well as a reading comprehension task. And in the listening comprehension task, everybody listened to the passages at the same relatively slow rate, but there were big individual differences in how well people did on the comprehension questions afterwards, right? And their performance in that listening comprehension correlated very highly with their comprehension performance on the reading. And then there was this other factor about speed that accounted a little bit for how fast they read, but it wasn't really, I always thought that was the least important part of it, right? Yes, you want to become proficient at the basic encoding of information. And so practice is probably the main thing that we have control over in that regard. I don't think that as much practice as I've done, and I've done a lot of practice reading, I've become a fast reader yet, but I've become faster than I was before. And practice strengthens connections, makes us more fluent. It's always a good thing. But speed reading techniques are not the answer. Okay. So, it used to be the case that there were these classes that you could take, and people would charge you like $2,000 to sign up for a 6-week class where you'd go spend 3 hours on one evening. These were for adults primarily who were working during the day to become a fast reader. Evelyn Wood reading dynamics. But they were really just techniques for glancing quickly over a page, picking up a couple of keywords, and getting a very general sense of what something was about without actually understanding what's actually being said. You can't understand what's actually being said unless you think about it. I am of the opinion that people should emphasize constructive engagement with the material and not speed.
Okay, so I like the part where you mentioned that it's not like learning faster, but it's actually understanding what you're learning, and that comes from being engaged in what you're doing. And you also said that practice makes you quicker, so it's not just about having a pill that'll make you fast.
Yeah.
Yes. Lastly, I want to ask, could you expand on the self-organizing map and competitive learning?
These two terms that you just introduced are terms from a field called sort of neural network modeling of, or maybe even modeling of the way in which the brain adjusts connections among neurons. It turns out that our visual system, for example, has a sort of a map of the visual space as it's projected onto our eyes. So when I'm looking, let's say, right at you on my screen now, there's a sheet of neurons at the back of my brain where essentially your face will be projected on one part of it, and around the edges, there'll be the things around you. So it'll lay the visual input that's coming in out as though it's on a sheet of paper, although it expands the center of gaze so that I have much higher resolution for what I'm looking right at than what's in my periphery. Okay, so it emphasizes what I'm focusing on, and everything around it becomes blurry. And if I move my eyes to some other place, then that becomes the center and it gets emphasized. So there's a map, but it's a distorted map that's focusing on the center of my attention. And a self-organizing map is a map that it is what we think of as being the process that goes on in your brain in early development that causes that map to get formed. So nobody's telling you to have this map. Somehow it just arises in your brain. And people were very interested in that, neuroscientists, but people who were more engineering oriented, but inspired by the brain as well, were interested in how could this process occur without there being some deliberate master plan. So the idea of self-organizing is that somehow the processes that take place in the interactions among neurons in your brain cause it to be the case that this arises spontaneously without there being any kind of a master plan. And competitive learning is a part of that. So if I can explain that briefly, many people have had this idea that there is a bit of a sort of a scaffolding laid down before the neurons start to fire, so that the inputs that the neurons in your brain receive are a bit laid out like a topographic map, a bit. So the neuron at one place on the brain surface will be listening to neurons at corresponding places in your eye. Okay, but that's a very weak tendency, and it gets strengthened by a process called competitive learning, where as inputs come in, the neuron that is most strongly activated by the input suppresses other neurons and tunes up its connections so that it responds more strongly to that particular part of the input. And that is a part of the process whereby this self-organizing map arises. This is a space of questions that's at a level of engagement with technical concepts and prior understanding about what I'm talking about. What is a neuron? What do I mean by connections between neurons? How do they change? It's a broad topic there of context that we probably don't have time for me to go into in more detail at this point, but it is an example of one of the kinds of ways in which I imagine our experience, just immersion in everyday life and the particular situations that we find ourselves in, cause our brains to become tuned up in ways that are experience dependent. And the self-organizing map is one part of that, I think.
So what I understood, correct me if I'm wrong, is that a self-organizing map is like the map, and it's a process of in the stage of the early development. So it's like all the information you're getting, getting organized like in your brain at a young age. And then competitive learning is when when like a question is posed, let's say 2 plus 2, then like the neurons are competing and they're like seeing which neuron knows like the answer to give to your brain. Is that correct? That's what I understood.
It's not usually used in the context of explicit factual mathematical knowledge like 2 plus 2, but it could be. Similar ideas have been used in modeling that. It's more just used in the basic formation of an actual sort of spatial relationships between. I guess competitive learning, in fact, could be involved in almost everything. I guess I should say you're right.
Okay.
Most people don't approach that form of explicit knowledge from the point of view of competitive learning, but it could well turn out, if you were to go to graduate school and pursue that question, you would have a new way of thinking about how our human brains learn mathematics.
Okay. So today we talked about a lot. We talked about memorization vs learning, the hippocampus in our brain, and then we talked about the two things that impact our learning, which is the speed of learning and then the attitude in which we start learning. And then we also talked about that how we view ourselves affects like our progress and our like results. And then another main thing we learned is that today that it's not about learning faster, it's about understanding what we're learning, and that to do that we have to emphasize motivation and engagement. And we also talked about the self-organizing map and competitive learning. So to wrap up, how can our audience learn more about you and your work?
I have a web page at Stanford University. And if you just type my name, James McClelland, Stanford, into your browser, you'll probably find my webpage. And there's lots of resources there, including papers that I've written, that some of which are intended for broader audiences, others are intended for very technical audiences. And there are a couple of videos that you could listen to hear more about my thoughts about mathematical cognition if you visit my webpage and you paw around a little bit. You can probably find me on YouTube in a few podcasts as well. I did a podcast with Lex Fridman, which many people have found interesting, I think, and have subsequently approached me about further conversations based on having listened to that. Finally, with a co-author, I have a book that's going to appear in October called The Emergent Mind. And it's intended for a broad audience, and certainly would encourage people to look for that book next fall.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. J, for taking your time today to share your wisdom with us. I learned a lot, and I'll definitely be on the lookout for the book, The Emergent Mind, and I hope our audience took away something too.
Great. Thanks so much, Seerat.
You are listening to Mindful, Beautiful, and Thriving, a podcast series by Tharaka Foundation. As part of our youth series, we will be releasing new episodes every month, so make sure to continue to check those out. We hope you enjoyed this podcast, and we thank you so much for listening.